Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you that you could have already seen this video simply by supporting the Poe Museum at patreon.com/Poe Museum. For tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt, I'd like to take you back to Prince Prospero's masquerade ball. Outside his castle, the peasants were dying of the Red Death, a plague which caused its victims to bleed from their pores and die in agony in the space of half an hour. So naturally, Prospero decided to throw a party, locking the world and all its cares outside. Now this party was full of revelers, and each room was decorated a different color, terminating in the Black Room, which ended with a tall clock, reminding everyone that time was fleeting. And then the party ended abruptly, when an uninvited guest showed up, enshrouded as if ready for the grave. His masked face looked every bit like that of a rotting corpse. When Prospero confronted this reveler, Prospero fell dead in his tracks, bleeding from his face. When the party guests surrounded this guest, they tore off his costume and revealed there was nothing underneath his mask.
This is the first printing of the story from the May 1842 issue of Graham's Magazine. Notice the original spelling of the title is M-A-S-K, rather than the later and established version M-A-S-Q-U-E. This refers to the actual mask that the character in the story is wearing. This is just one of Poe's stories that addresses the real 19th century fear of plagues and pandemics. But it's not Poe's first story on the subject. That would be this one right up here, Shadow. Shadow was first published in the September 1835 issue of the Southern Literary Messenger. Right here on page 762. It's a story set during an ancient plague when 7 men are waiting in a room for the presence of death to arrive. They sit there surrounding a corpse. And even in this issue, Poe included another plague story. Just a few pages earlier, it's King Pest, a tale containing an allegory. This is one that Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Treasure Island, wrote as a reviewer. He said, "It would be criminal in the reviewer to spare one harsh word in the expression of his own loathing and horror, lest by its absence another victim should be permitted to soil himself with the perusal of the infamous King Pest. He who could write King Pest had ceased to be a human being." Now that's an endorsement. And King Pest definitely is in bad taste. It's about 2 drunken sailors who stumble into a city during the time of the plague. Death and decay are all around them. And it's a comedy. Here's a great description that almost sounds like something Poe might have seen himself. The air was damp, cold, and misty. The paving stones, loosened from their beds, lay in wild disorder among the tall, rank grass which spread up hideously around the feet and ankles. Rubbish of fallen houses choked up the streets. The most fetid and poisonous smells everywhere prevailed. And by the occasional aid of that ghastly, uncertain light, which even at midnight never fails to emanate from a vapory and pestilent atmosphere, might be discerned lying in the bypaths and alleys, or rotting in the windowless habitations, the carcass of many a nocturnal plunderer arrested by the hand of the plague in the very perpetration of his robbery. So dead bodies decaying right there in the streets. So of course the drunken sailors stumble into a party, which is a death party, led by the self-proclaimed King Pest the First. He and his friends are gathered around a table in a room illuminated by a light inside the skull of a skeleton hanging from the ceiling. They're all drinking out of human skulls and awaiting their own death. One of the partiers is already in a coffin with armholes punched out the side so they can continue to drink. So definitely in bad taste, especially considering the timing. This was published just 3 years after the great 1832 cholera pandemic swept the world from India to North America, wiping out millions of people in its path. And this is something that Poe had experienced. He lost his best friend, Ebenezer Burling, during this pandemic. He was in Baltimore and saw the bodies being carried outside the city. Too many were dying too quickly. There's no way to bury them. So they're putting them in carts, hauling them to the edge of the city to mass graves. This was a world that Poe knew. So he decided to write a comedy. So you can see why Robert Louis Stevenson thought this was a tad bit in bad taste. Poe himself lived to see another cholera pandemic, the 1849 one that also wiped out hundreds of thousands of people. And Poe left us a great description, which was transcribed by John Robertson in a manuscript we have right here at the Poe Museum. It starts out, "I was once in Philadelphia during the prevalence of the cholera there. Hundreds were dying every day, and the gloomy aspect of things out of doors, the hurrying to and fro of physicians and nurses, and the constant passing of funeral processions was in mournful contrast to the intense blue of the sky and the garish sunlight that rested upon the city. When darkness came down, the long vistas of gas lamps in the streets, twinkling away into little points of light in the distance, and the bright, steady, peaceful planetary gleam of the stars overhead, seemed to mock the desolation of the heart that reigned around." So when Poe writes these horror stories, he's writing about things he knew, things he'd survived. Here are a couple newspapers from New York City at the time. This one is from November of 1848. And you'll look at the weekly report of deaths right here. They just lost 213 people that week out of about 300,000. Now let's fast forward to July of 1849 during the prevalence of the cholera. And you'll see in 1 week, 702 deaths. And leading causes of death there, 317 died of cholera, 31 of cholera infantum, 10 of cholera morbus. There's also 25 people died of diarrhea, which was one of the symptoms of cholera. But if you look very closely, you'll also see that one person that week died of drinking cold water. You never knew how dangerous cold water was until now. And here's an 1849 issue of the same paper. Right here there's an article about cholera being cured with chloroform. Apparently Dr. Struther tried everything he could think of. In one patient he tried opium, morphine, and musk, but it didn't cure the patient. But another one he does try chloroform, and it seems to cure him right up. An article down here actually proposes that cholera might be caused by fear. It reports on a case from New Orleans about a woman who went to market and she saw a crowd that had gathered. She went to get a closer look, and when she got into the middle, she saw there came a ghastly object. It was the head of a collapsed, emaciated corpse, which by the jolting of the cart had been forced out of one end of the rough box or coffin in which it had been deposited by the keepers of the prison. where the unfortunate victim died. The sight produced such horror and dismay in the poor woman that she had hardly strength to drag herself home when she was immediately seized with all the symptoms of spasmodic cholera. So people then still weren't sure what caused cholera. They thought it could be fear, it could be sinful living, could be alcohol. In fact, some cities banned alcohol. They said, drink more water. Now, of course, we know that cholera is spread in the water, so that was the worst advice they could have given. And here's the December 21st, 1848 issue of the same paper, and you can see a cure for cholera, Dr. Rees on cholera, treatment of cholera, the cholera a curable disease. And people are throwing everything they can at this, trying to figure out how to solve it. This article actually proposes that what you should do is cut open the veins of each foot of the patient and let it bleed into hot water from 12 to 20 minutes, according to sex. So I guess depending on your gender, you get to bleed more or less, and maybe that will cure it. And here's a good one that has the great cure-all of the day. This is something that will cure your cholera, your diphtheria, your tuberculosis. It's the great pill calomel. Of course, now we know it's made of mercury, so it'll probably kill you in the process, but you're going to die either way. But cholera is far from the only pandemic that stalked the populace during Poe's day. And there are a couple other really good contenders for the disease that could have inspired the Masque of the Red Death. So on the next installment of the Curator's Crypt, we'll explore yellow fever and tuberculosis as we try to track down the origins of Poe's classic terror tale.